Mard and Gasc, Wheel of Fire, Part 1. A knock came on the wide oaken door of the temple. Gasc lurched forward, his head lifting off the wood of the pew he had been dozing on. He raised a bleary eye to the front doors as they rattled, with what could only be another round of sharp knuckle strikes. He finally dragged himself to his feet, and as he rose, glanced at the tome, Life of an Ambushed Knight, that lay on the pew to his left, vaguely recalling dreams of valor that he had been summoned from. Waking life was so much bleaker, so bereft of songs and stories of strong men and willing women. Tapping leather shoes across smooth tile and reaching the front doors, he ducked down to peer through a keyhole. A chill swept off the river just outside, blasting him in one blue eye after he managed to take in a trio of wavering well-wishers. With a sigh like that of wind pouring out of a canyon, he pulled the door ring, squinting as torchlight and fetid river breeze assailed his senses. Broad grins came to life on the well-wishers' faces, but their eyes were flat and lacked the subtlest notes of freeborn agency. Gasc received them, croaking like frogs on a log of time, bobbing to the tune of imagined immortality. "Young lad, a blessing upon ye, and a wonder ye broadened your doors to us on such a joyous eve of the Creators," began a pole-thin center wisher. "Creation," bobbed the head of the left wisher, this one thicker of limb and waist. The third merely smiled, eyes folded in soft wrinkles, head slightly swaying, perched atop a mound of sackcloth. All three wore similarly meager dress and carried leather-wrapped tomes whose mustiness wafted directly into Gasc's nostrils, eliciting a sneeze. "Creator bless ye, child," expelled the pole-thin wisher, wiping a trail of mucus from Gasc's chin with one robe sleeve. "We've come to tell ye the joys to be sought, only from within, ever from within, on this joyous eve of the Creator," finished the thick wisher. "Only from within," Gasc began. "So you say, the Creator lives in me?" "He does," piped the pole-thin. "He lives in us all. Bless him. Bless us. Now that you've received the blessing, would you love to sing... Now that you've received the blessing, we would love to sing ye a hymn for a small donation." "'Tis a most joyous eve of winter solstice," added the thick. "A night when none should be turned away, least of all the well-wishers of him, the beloved Creator." "My father worships another deity, the sword-marked Creator, as you can see." Gasc nodded up at a simple iron longsword mounted above the temple doors. He turned a ponderous eye on the well-wishers. "By love, we see! Yes, and 'tis for this reason that ye opened your doors to us. We must believe. We must believe!" Before Gasc shut the door in their faces, a red dot of light in the night sky appeared that he had never noticed before. Then the door slammed, and he turned his bone-thin shoulders back up an empty row of pews that led to a flat stone altar and a door to its right. The frail lad of 13 winters returned to his pew to clutch the adventure tome in his sweaty palm, before crossing the sanctuary to tap on the door to his father's study. After a moment, a grumble sounded in response, and he pulled on the door ring with all his might, swinging it open to scurry inside. His father looked up over rectangular spectacles, grunting and waving his hand dismissively. Seeming not to notice, the lad approached his father's desk. Papers sat neatly piled in a stack to his father's right, and a stout well sat to his left as he reached for more ink. The obsidian substance flowed like a river, plodding ceaselessly on in its elegant slant. The lad studied his father's movements. Long, thin fingers, smooth and white, maneuvered the pen with the ease of a master fencer. The spoken word seldom slipped from his lips, but letters crashed like a waterfall, ever intent on being released. Watching as the letters took form, the lad yearned for meaning. Then he witnessed a shape that sparked memories held firm in his mind. He fixated on the name of their temple's patron saint, Sabaeus. Dreamlike images of battle flooded back into the lad's mind view. A silver sword raised on high urged weary men on over golden fields to clash against steely legions. Cries for freedom rang out in blood-boiling ears, building to cacophony as white knuckles clenched his adventure tome tight. Soon the ancient struggle was lost in the collapse of time, as his own name brought him back to the present. Gascoigne, I told you, never interrupt me during composition. Where is your mother? The lad shook his shaggy brown head from side to side, then shrugged his shoulders, eyes downcast. Likely drinking with her cohorts in the pleasure district again, sniffed his father, returning to scribble across his beloved parchment. Pale, bloodshot, and bespectacled eyes never rose to meet his son's watery orbs. Tomorrow I must deliver this sermon to the congregation. Leave me now, and do not disturb me again. Gasc shifted uneasily, eyes rimmed with wetness, before he made his way back to the oaken door and pushed through to the sanctuary beyond. Pews stood arrayed to either side of him as he padded on his bare feet to a stained glass window. He peered out through the golden lens, made luminescent by a pale moon that hung so low it was almost in line with his eyes. The lad pressed his fingertips against cold glass and looked out upon a noisome night in the port city of Baradier. 7 years ago, his father purchased a cheap stretch of land on the Fetid River, adjacent to the pleasure district where Gasc's mother spent most of her nights. The warm lantern lights of the district flickered at the edge of Gasc's vision as brazen merchants and painted ladies sauntered along. Silent songs rose on their lips as they danced beyond the glass barrier that distorted his vision. They strode past beggars with outstretched hands, begging for coin with feeble, serrated lips. One beggar tugged at the silken robe of a passing merchant who looked familiar to Gasc. The beggar muttered something about the beloved Creator, prompting a scornful regard from the merchant and squeals from his lady. The merchant raised a too-full stein and tipped it slightly, spilling its contents over the beggar's ashen beard. A white-flecked tongue emerged to taste the numbing brew, rounding his lips in ecstasy. Yet, as the stein continued to tilt, a spill became a pour, washing the old man's face and dousing his tangled locks. Gasc watched the sheen of silver moonlight reflect off the beggar's face as it became slick with ale. Sputtering, the beggar fell forward on his hands and knees. The merchant responded by delivering a sharp kick to the beggar's gut, dropping him back to the cobbles. Raucous laughter roiled through the merchant's frame before he jerked his lady away by the hip, a callous hand guiding her cackling lips farther into the night. 3 robed figures appeared out of the darkness, approaching the prostrate beggar, but Gasc had lost interest, looking up at the red dot in the night sky. Nodding to himself, he recognized the merchant as Master Shank, one of his father's most generous patrons on sermon day, yet the lady at his side hardly resembled his wife. Moving from the window and stepping back into rows of pews, Gasc sighed, running a moist hand through greasy, unkempt growth on his head. Echoes of a scratching quill filtered to his ears, reminding him of his father's tireless work ethic. Words to elevate the minds and souls of his father's flock were being crafted to bind them one and all in unity and purpose. Here in the temple's stone halls was a place of solace and reflection, to escape from the cruel reality of privilege and enter a place where all were equals. Gasc knew sheep of the flock were also merchants, their smirking faces popping into his mind as he recalled them. Many of those who prayed on the week and whored in the pleasure district were members of his father's church. So too were those fortunate sons of the temple, the ones who flipped forward gold coins when offering time began. Sinners kept the hearth burning at night to warm the bones of Gasc and his parents, enabling timely tax collections to the governor. Those foul acts Gasc could not forgive. Yet the mantra of their faith was one of forgiveness for all, of hope that springs from remorse. However, merely regretting one's actions was not enough for young Gasc. Those who sinned would likely sin again, and they did not deserve a second chance. 2. The very next morning, Gasc rose from his bed, a couple bags of flour, and his pillow, a bread basket. Emerging from his pantry bedroom, he stifled a belch, having devoured a loaf of sourdough and half a jar of honey the night before. Creeping through the kitchen past his parents' bedroom, he looked in as his father whimpered, and his mother grunted in dream state call and response. He peered through his parents' keyhole, seeing his mother lying draped across the bed, father sidled up against the edge, desperately seeking separation. Her hair was bedraggled, her shift awry, an upper lip tinged with yellow. The odor of sweat and sour tinge of vomit made its way through the keyhole before Gasc could duck away, and he nearly gagged, betraying his secrecy. Heat rifled up his ears as small fists clenched, and he turned to a tower of kitchen drawers. Pulling drawer 2 and 3 out halfway, he started climbing up, reaching up for 5 and 6 on his way to the top. To reach it, he had to stand on a series of drawers pulled out and balanced just so that they would not eject, as he reached for the clasp of the topmost drawer, a full 9 feet off the ground. Finding the brass knob under his fingers, his toes started to wiggle, as drawer 5 creaked under his feet. Gripping the knob, he pulled drawer 9 open, stretching his hands higher still, then down inside the drawer itself to settle upon smooth mahogany. With pure finger strength, he managed to extract the flatware chest, lifting it above his head with 2 hands like a champion's prize. Sidling the chest under one arm and carefully closing each drawer in his descent, he reached the kitchen tile and padded away, down the stairs, through the sanctuary, and out the front door into morning mist. Coming to the market on Sermon Day, none of those who worshipped Sabaeus could be found, but there was one merchant tent erected in sight before the hopeful lad. As he approached, he noticed it was filled with men from the faraway desert lands of Turan, who worshipped the 8-pointed red sun. He approached the tent of camel hides, poking his head inside. The place was dimly lit by brass oil lamps, fragrant with wisps of incense, and filled with dark-haired, dark-eyed men wearing loose robes and bartering in strange languages. They all sat on tasseled pillows or stood around a central carpet. The carpet was colorful and grand, like nothing Gasc had ever seen before, and he could not imagine the pop-up tent operating without it. With a casual nod of his shaggy brown head, Gasc walked into their midst, and knelt before them on their woven carpet, drawing the flatware chest out from under his drab tunic. The men's eyes languidly drifted over to the boy, who had so brazenly entered their tent, and sat on their carpet before them. One of the men reached into his robes, perhaps thumbing a knife. Another moved to the tent flap and pulled it closed. A third man sat before Gasc, and spread his palms out wide to either side. "To what do we owe the honor of a visit from a young ambushman such as yourself?" said the Turan who sat before Gasc. Gasc smiled in response and unclasped his chest, lifted its lid, throwing silvery glints across his blue eyes, then turned the chest to face the man and pushed it forward. The man's dark eyes took on a new glow, silver filling them as well, leaving them gray with longing. Slender, caramel-colored fingers swept over the mahogany chest and procured a single silver spoon. The utensil ascended before the eyes of the Turan as his fellows gathered around, even the one who had suspiciously placed a hand in his robes. Gasc continued to smile and folded his arms, awaiting an appraisal. "Young ambushman, these spoons of silver are quite lovely, of centuries-old Delchin make. I would never eat with them, but it just so happens I am one to collect antiquities. For the set, I will happily offer you 100 gold pieces. A fair price, I think," said the Turan, drawing out a large brown sack of coin that jingled as he placed it on the carpet. 3 sets of dark eyes rose up to meet Gasc's blues in anticipation. Gasc tapped a finger to his lip and asked, "Do you all frequent the fighting pits of Moortown?" "Why, yes," the Turan began. "We were planning on making a visit this very day, once we finish our dealings here at the market." "Well, it appears I am the only creator's son to have made his way into your market this day. I dare say there are not many Turans of the Red Sun in Baradier. Damn shame, since I find you lot rather charming. As morning wanes, it does not appear there is much more business to be conducted this day. What say we make our way to the pits, and I buy the first round with this fat sack you just offered me?" The spoon buyer's eyes brightened, and as he glanced at his fellows, so too did theirs. All at once they burst out laughing, then darted to different parts of the tent, packing up their belongings. "I like you, young ambushman," said the first Turan, patting Gasc on the shoulder. "You are as bold as a little boar, quite resourceful, as I know you must have stolen those spoons from your parents, and you know what you want. A good fight and a good pot of ale. A man of my own mind." He gave a small bow. "You may call me Gwab. A pleasure to do business." In a matter of moments, the Turans had packed up their entire tent of goods, and it resided now in packs that each of them carried on their backs with little strain. Marching behind the young ambush boy of nigh 13 summers, they quit the abandoned Sermon Day market and made their way down the canal. Walking along its wide blue stretch, lined with stout trees that blossomed pink and white, young couples strode by on their morning strolls, gasping at the sight of a boy in such company as a ragtag pack of Turans. Gasc led on, head high, money sack swaying from his belt. 3. The fighting pits of Moortown were a place renowned and reviled in Baradier. It was a place Gasc's mother had many times warned him never to visit, either alone or with strangers. Fortunate, then, it was that he had collected the names of his Turan chaperones, Gwab the Golden, Said the Shiv, and Moloch the Mouse. Walking along the canal at their side were the many fine silk robes of sophisticated students and educators from the world's foremost academies of science and learning that all stood nearby in magnificent ruddy stone. Swaying newly boisterous elbows in his haste to see a good fight, Gasc thumped an elderly professor in the ribs. The elder flattened against the ground, tossing a bundle of books across the cobbles and launching his spectacles in the process. "Hooligan! I'll have your head for this!" The educator clambered to his feet, adjusting his educator's robe, snatching up, and finally affixing his spectacles to regard the lad who stood, arms on hips, flanked by 3 bearded, menacing Turans. Said had his hand in his robes again, and this time he almost pulled the knife out with it. But unfortunately for the educator, he harumphed his way out of the encounter, pricking up speed and keeping to the side of the walking path this time. Taking a left and crossing a bridge named after a well-known educator, Gasc and his pack of Turans made their way over the canal and down into the fens, an area surrounded by more academies, cathedrals, and towering stone manses. The fens stood in the shadow of high kleptocracy. They found the circular walls and sharp drop-off that led into the fighting pits of Moortown. Moortown was a settlement on the back of the canal where pirates, rum runners, and fur traders settled. It was an outpost on the west end of Baradier that led to the frontier, wide open highways and ambush countryside. Mythic Moortown finally stood before Gasc, the wellspring of fantasy and adventure in his eager mind. It was not a clean place, nor was it orderly. People in their living quarters existed haphazardly. Cows ate grass from between cobbles in the street, and cowherds slept hungover in wagons of hay. Bottles of amber water and jugs of gut drink lined the streets, erect and toppled, slipping from fingers, empty and half full, to clatter and roll, as spectators shuffled into fighting pits, where crowds roared and sang fight songs. Love that Barrow's water and sweet Aberdeen. Gasc led the Turons to Bleacher Tavern, a pub built into the arena's inner wall, where one could watch fights without paying for a ticket to get up into the stands. Sitting on a stool in the observation deck, Gasc snapped his fingers, as a buxom serving girl with long curly locks appeared from around the row of drunken louts, bearing 4 pints. "I'll take the tray." Gasc jutted his chin out at her and placed 4 gold coins in her outstretched palm, followed by a 4th a moment later. She placed the tray on the table and turned away, giving Gasc a look back and half a smile as she left. Leaning back on his stool, the lad raised his pint glass to clink against those of his 3 compatriots. "To new friends in low places," Gasc chuckled to himself, followed by an emphatic, "Down the hatch!" The Turons eagerly emptied their round of pints, immediately requesting a 2nd and 3rd round, which Gasc was happy to oblige. By this time it was the most any of them had ever consumed, as Gasc had never owned more than 3 gold pieces in his life, and the Turons had only ever smoked their intoxicants, refraining from drink. All 4 became enthused observers of the games below, reveling in contests of strength and endurance taking place below them. Lithe gladiators, armed with tridents and nets, stalked ravenous wolves, starved for days at a time in their holding pens below the pits. One by one the 3 gladiators were tasked with hunting down the snapping wolves. The gladiators did not come away from these encounters unscathed. However, soon after completion, they were pitted against a squad of heavily armed and armored warriors endorsed by Baradiran nobles. Affectionately referred to as the Golden Governors, they wore full helms plumed with red horsehair, steel breastplates, and gold-hilted broadswords. Resembling centurions of the Garzian Old Guard, the noble aesthetic clearly aspired to the excellence of antiquity. Gasc put down 50 gold pieces on a 20-1 bet against the Golden Governors, which Gwab took him up on. After a few bloody moments of watching with bated breath, which turned to horror, shock, and finally acceptance, Gasc grabbed what gold pieces remained his, filled his pockets, and left the rest of the sack on the table for Gwab. Gasc turned to sulk away, chin to his chest, but he did not even leave the table before Gwab caught him by the collar and patted his shoulder. "I've got us covered at the next spot, right across the street." The games were getting out now, and Gwab led them to another establishment, leading them down to a basement sectioned by heavy curtains and filled with smoke. Here nobles puffed at long hoses, and half-dressed women draped themselves over furniture, mesmerized by patterns on intricate ceiling tiles. The 4 found their way to the back of the smoking den, sitting around a large brass contraption that resembled an octopus, with a hose extending out to each of them. A servant girl arrived, bearing a coal, and placed it on top, lighting it with a candle. The Turons breathed deep from their hoses, letting out purple gases into the air. Gasc took a puff, and before he knew it, a man cried out in the next section over. He dropped his hose and crawled forward on hands and knees to lift and peek through the curtain. Beyond, he witnessed a large beast, covered in umber fur, with great horns that extended from his head. 2 hooves crossed at the ankle as the beast drew deep from a hookah hose and expelled a cloud from his nostrils, releasing a titanic sigh. Gasc watched, with mouth agape, at the muscled monstrosity, never knowing such a creature could exist. Then he felt a pinch, and pulled his head back through to find Saeed had extracted the coins from his pocket and was dropping them into Gwab's sack. Gasc fumed, rising to his feet and trembling, with half a mind to knock over the hookah. Instead, a scream erupted from his lungs. "Thieves! Damn thieves of Tehran!" Suddenly, Saeed's knife was out, and Moloch was already scurrying out of the section toward the door, and with a half-bow, Gwab did the same. Shrugging, Saeed sheathed his knife and followed. However, another 4 Turans entered Gwab's section at the accusation of thieves from their climb. These men drew knives as well and descended upon Gasc, faces contorted in rage. Pulled by his ankles, the lad yelped as his chin hit the floor, and he was yanked back through the curtain. On the other side he came up, with the Minotaur's fetid muzzle in his face. Livid yellow eyes and snorts of steam filled Gasc's vision as the beast ground its flat teeth and brandished a scimitar in one paw. Slicing through the curtain wall, the 4 Turans leapt into the Minotaur's section to join them. Gasc scrambled back, nearly knocking over the hookah. Rising on his hooves, the Minotaur slashed a backhand diagonally across, spilling the intestines of the first Turan across another colorful carpet. As the second Turan came on, the Minotaur stepped into a front hoof kick that launched him back into his section, tearing a new hole in the curtain. Shouts and cries of battle broke all around as the hiss of blades being drawn clamored in a chorus. Snarling, the Minotaur caught the wrist of the third Turan, who tried to stab him in the belly. Turning the hand over in his great paw, the Turan's wrist bones popped out of his flesh as he howled in agony, falling backward. Finally, the 4th Turan was soon nowhere to be found, and the Minotaur turned to Gasc. "Look what you've done! I stole this hookah by all good rights, and now we've got hell to pay. To think, I just finished the governor's gauntlet. Can a man get a moment's rest?" "First of all," Gasc raised a finger, "you don't look like much of a man to me. Secondly, I do appreciate your notion of might makes right and honor amongst thieves. Thirdly, you are a gladiator? I should have known. With a build like that and the quickness of a jungle cat, why, do you need a manager?" "Seen a few fights, have you?" The Minotaur raised a bushy eyebrow. "You don't look a day over 9 summers, but if you know your stuff, I suppose we can talk later. Not easy to find a manager for what appears to be a Minotaur." "Appears to be? Say, what do I call you?" "Name's Mard," the Minotaur answered, dropping into a low defensive stance, as 6 members of the Barrow-Deer Guard, armored in chainmail, filled the section, bearing longswords and kite shields. 5. Gasc awoke, cold and lying on a damp stone floor, bathed in darkness. He shivered, hugging his knees tight and rolling up into a ball in the corner. A clink sounded to his left as he raised a bleary eye to see in the moonlight. The Minotaur was chained to the wall in the cell next to him. Both eyes bruised, lip bloodied, and lacerations crisscrossed his chest and legs. The beast had seen better days. Manacled and shackled against the grimy wall of his cell, Gasc could see now the full height of the Minotaur, an appalling 8 feet of muscle, corded like bands of iron. How such a creature had come to be, Gasc could not fathom. Finding his feet, he moved to a window that looked out over the Istrin River. Sea breeze reaching his senses, and moonlight spilling over its glassy surface. Gasc wondered what exactly he had smoked from that Turan hookah, those traitorous bastards who made off with his gold. Gasc never intended on spending all the gold in one night at Moortown's fighting pits. This was to be the first night in the rest of his life. Next day he would seek out the port of Ostend and a new life in Anacron, that fabled land said to lie across the western sea. No more would he be a preacher's son, nor would he mop floors and empty chamber pots for leprous and lecherous patrons of the temple. Sabaeus could be damned for all he thought. The saint had brought nothing to Gasc's family save lordlings and merchants who believed their gold permitted lives of impunity, an irony of the faith indeed. As if in response to his thoughts of retribution, Gasc spied between the bars a familiar red dot growing larger in the sky above. It left a bright trail as it edged its way across the night sky, seeming to descend toward the city. A wrench of dread welled up inside of him, expelling his 3 pints on the cell floor. Frantic eyes peered back out on lacquered carriages speeding merrily along in the night, darting past the river's edge. In contrast to the silvery moonlight, flickers of scarlet began to shine off the Istran. Gasc settled his eyes on the crimson orb, gleaming alight with streaks of flame. As it traveled over the Istran, it hung in the air for what seemed like an eternity. A notion of irrevocable doom swept over Gasc, tapping primal horror he never knew existed, gooseflesh rising across his body. The Minotaur must have felt it too, thrashing his great head side to side, chipping one of his horns on the wall and groaning. Suddenly the orb burst in a cataclysmic explosion, illuminating gray heaven and the cobbled path of every onlooker and passerby. Spiraling claws of flame lanced out over the river and coalesced into a wheel of fire spinning on an axis. The flash dispersed as quickly as it appeared, night closing back around the turning wheel of fire. Out from the wheel dropped the nigh imperceptible outline of an irregular but rounded form. It slipped out from the blaze to drop with a splash 200 yards from Gasc's window. Only by the perceptive eyes of the lad could the shape be seen, and Gasc had seen it. Now the otherworldly sight could not be erased as his mind unraveled in attempts to explain. Carriages stopped in their tracks, drivers standing up on platforms to gaze in the fiery portal. Onlookers babbled to each other as they approached the water's edge, pulled along as if by an invisible thread. Gasc looked out over black waters, desperately seeking movement within the gently lapping current of the Istran, finding nothing. Then, with the roar of a raging tempest, the wheel of fire collapsed in on itself, contracting till naught remained but yellowish mist settling on the river. As mist poured out over the water, silver moonlight permeated, creating a golden haze that obscured what lay beneath. City dwellers on either bank shrugged and murmured, unimpressed. Some departed, climbing back into carriages or gathering the arms of spouses to resume nightly strolls. As milling folk turned away, a slick white appendage broke the surface of the river and extended skyward. Gasc stammered, seeking to alert the Minotaur. Shuddered gasps rose from the lips of onlookers as they took heed. The appendage rose 20 feet in the air before slamming down onto the bank and slithering one end around the wheel of a carriage. The carriage was dragged sideways, popping off a wheel, tearing up cobblestones, and starting down the bank, provoking shrieks from women and children inside. With a wild jerk of the appendage, the carriage launched into the air over the Istran, horses and all, before landing with a horrific splash and quickly sinking from sight. As the horses were dragged under by the weight of the carriage, the waters raged with their flailing legs. Gasc stammered, looking to the citizens who stood on either side of him, mouths agape in horror as they watched. In a rising wave of screams, people turned and fled the riverbank. More appendages rose up, ghastly pale tentacles that reached out and lashed people by their ankles, snapping them down into the bank, into the churning shallows. Gasc finally heard a tremendous grunt as manacles binding Mard's wrists shattered into pieces. Then the Minotaur reached down and tore the chain that bound his ankles as well. Sliding off the wall, the Minotaur massaged a crick in his neck and rolled his shoulder. Next, he promptly kicked down his cell door with one hoof, rotated, and stomped through the door to Gasc's cell with the other hoof, bending over and rubbing both knees as pained gasps escaped his leathery muzzle. Mard gave Gasc a headshake, indicating he should clear the way to his window. Wide-eyed, Gasc backed up against the dungeon wall. Mard crouched low and bent his neck, then exploded in a forward charge, blasting his head and shoulder through the brick wall and finding himself hovering in midair over Istran River. Then, after the meaty Minotaur joined the watery menagerie with a huge splash, he reached a paw up to tread water, but soon disappeared. Intrigued, the otherworldly beast turned away from its civilian prey. A current marked its passage beneath the inky surface of the Istran as it moved across the river to the space below the dungeon. As Gasc peered through a gap roughly the size and shape of an 8-foot minotaur. Gasc watched as the pale, bulbous head of the beast rose slowly into view. Its face, if it could be called that, was covered in a dozen or more watery eyes, staring hungrily up at the lad who stood 10 feet above in the dungeon wall gap. His mouth would not move as he stared into the many eyes of madness. His body started to quiver as he smelled rotting and maybe even fresh flesh within the beak-like, spine-filled jaws of the beast. Pallid tentacles reached out, 6 of them converging from different angles toward the lad's body. Frozen to his perch, Gasc gaped into the maw of infinity as it widened. Then, a bellowing howl escaped the beaked lips before they slammed shut, well short of his face. The beast jerked backward, tentacles framing the air around Gasc and slipping low over the water. Spinning on its side, the ovular beast thrashed around as Gasc noticed a dark form clutched tight to its backside. As it rotated, Gasc soon lost sight of the giant shape that gripped the beast's smooth and round surface. Gasc climbed out over the Istran, making his way across the outer dungeon wall to the cobbles of the street beyond, then sprinted back in the direction of his father's temple. When he arrived, Gasc's father stood outside, a sword-marked tome of the Creator nestled under his arm as he watched his son approach. "Quickly, inside with you," the father urged his son, grabbing him by the back of his tunic. Gasc slapped his father's hand away. "I will not! I must see this for myself. No creature of this kind has ever been seen before. It is a sight that may never be seen again, and you ask me to hide." "Gascoigne, get inside, now!" His father reached for him again, still clutching the tome in his other hand. "Your mother will be raving mad if I lose you to a sea beast." "No!" cried the boy, dodging the reach, then slapping the tome out of his father's hand. The tome spilled open, falling, binding up on the cobbles. His father shrieked and lifted the tome tight to his chest, cradling it in his arms. He looked upon delicate parchment, now smeared with mud. Gasc shook his head, spitting on the ground before running to the riverbank. When he looked out, he saw nothing but churning turmoil in the water, with the occasional geyser produced from Mard's colossal struggle beneath its surface. Framing the round shape of the beast, a wave swept up over the bank, and the creature's tentacles were left when it washed away, rooted in the mud with spiny suction cups. Hurled from the back of the beast was Mard's great form, tumbling across the cobbles behind Gasc. The lad looked over his shoulder, seeing the Minotaur rise in anger, to stand on 2 hooves, then bend, to yank the wheel spoke off a shattered carriage. From behind, Gasc could hear water thrashing again, an odor of decaying flesh, and the hiss of the beast. He sprinted forward and tumbled across the bank, attempting to escape their next clash. Gasc watched the warring monsters from his back now, as Mard plunged his wheel spoke into one of its dozen eyes, splattering his muzzle with gray goo and eliciting a chorus of mind-cleaving screeches. "Begone, foul beast!" Gasc heard a voice call from the street above. Then the man himself stepped forward, wielding the longsword from the archway above its temple doors. It was the symbol of Sabaeus, a decorative blade which stood for the honor and pride of a unified Ambran after throwing off Garzian overlords century before. The thin, gray-haired man bore the longsword in his black robes of the faith, other hand clutching the holy tome, standing like a paladin serving in defense of his temple. Gasc knew his father was no warrior, and he tried to cry out to warn him, but it was already too late. Attracted by the boldness in his voice, the tentacle beast leapt off of Mard and rolled forward, lashing its barbed tentacles out and catching hold of the holy man. The priest was gathered up by milky white appendages, which dragged their hooks across his torso, tearing flesh from his bones and exposing his chest cavity to the cold of night. Gasc's father screamed out, his saintly longsword clattering to the cobbles, as blood painted the white bulbous mound in crimson. The beaks opened wide, and lurched toward his abdomen before a furry form scrambled beneath its bulk, gripping the longsword hilt and driving it straight up into the brain of the beast. Writhing spasmodically, the beast was released, but the tentacles extended and lashed at will, lifting stones and slicing the Minotaur's flesh as well. Mard roared, in two hands, dragging the longsword up as he stood, cleaving the beast's face in two, splitting its 12 eyes down the middle. 5. Gasc rolled off his flour bag bed, panting and wiping cold sweat from his brow. Stretching his legs, he sat up, kneading the tremors in his forehead. Surely the events of the day before had to have been a dream, a sick manifestation of his desire for adventure. Then he heard low-pitched chanting in Old Garzian and rubbed his eyes, yawning, wondering when he might finally get a good night's rest. The lad fumbled across the hall, dropping jars of tomatoes and pickles to smash on the floor before escaping his lightless pantry bedroom to stagger through the kitchen. Chanting continued, this time clearer, echoing up the stairway to him from the sanctuary below. He took a left before descending the stairs to spy on his parents' bedroom, hoping to find them, as always, his mother sleeping drunkenly and his father cowering in the corner, pretending to sleep. However, the bed was empty, save for a small piece of parchment. With a deep sigh, Gasc slowly made his way to the bed and picked up the parchment, reading, Dearest Gascoigne and Eugene, this old world has grown too weary for me, and I have decided to start a new life somewhere newer, somewhere warmer, and somewhere drier. I've taken my jewelry, the donation coffers, and the rest of our flatware, and booked passage for Anacron. If you come seeking, you won't find me, for I have changed my name and my appearance. All of my love, your wife and mother. Gasc shook his head and gritted his teeth in disbelief, letting the parchment fall to the bed. Then he turned on his heel and descended the stairs to investigate who was chanting. In the sanctuary, he found Mard sitting on a pew, his horned head bowed in prayer. This was an odd sight indeed, and Gasc suspected all at once that the monstrous beast was a more devout worshipper of the Creator than himself, the son of a preacher. On the stone altar, Gasc's father was laid, candles burning all around him, his chest cavity still enjoying night air, pooling blood on the floor below. In front of the altar, however, there was drawn on the floor a 5.5-foot long oval intersected with 8 lines. Before the oval stood a short, strange fellow with a long white beard. Gasc had never seen this man before, and his green eyes, which looked at him expectantly, almost appeared to be emeralds, in the way they caught firelight. The man's face was white as marble, and he stood only 4 feet tall, wearing a circular red cap and green velvet robes, a gnarled oak stave in his palm that he tapped on the floor. With a stubby tongue, he licked a pair of dusty lips before speaking.
Good young Gascoigne, it is a pleasure to finally meet you, spoke the man, bowing low. I am of the Order of Sabaeus, a good friend and mentor of your father's in life, and I hope to be a guide for him in death as well. I have served the sword-marked Creator for many, many moons, and in this time I have risen to the office we refer to as Life Priest.
Life Priest? Gasc stuttered. I've heard of you, but can it really be? My father told me you were the chief worshipper of Sabaeus, the very speaker to his divine word, the conduit to his direct guidance.
The same,
nodded the Life Priest, tapping his small oak stave on the stones again. You are rather short, Gasc grinned, tilting his head to the side.
I am old. Age has sought to deprive me of excess physicality, but I assure you, my mind and my abilities are greater than anything you can comprehend, young one.
Well, it seems you are too late. My father lies dead on this altar. What guidance do you hope to give him at this hour?
Perhaps not him, but perhaps you.
The Life Priest reached out, and placed his index finger on Gasc's forehead. The lad almost knocked the hand away, as he had done to his father earlier, standing on the bank before the beast tore him open. That thought made Gasc reel. The sight of his father, grabbed up by tentacles and torn asunder, struck a dagger deep into his gut, doubling him over, falling to his knees, then to his side. Lights flickered across his vision, candle flames starting to spin in a wheel-like pattern.
Your father can still serve, and so can you,
continued the life priest, his voice smooth and hypnotic now. Mard rose to standing and pulled Gasc's body into the oval circle drawn on the floor.
You will be his guide from this life into the next. You two will now be forever one and inseparable.
What? Mard? Why? What are you talking about? I don't feel right. What did you do to me? Gasc's words flowed out like endless rain, slithering and slipping away. 6. Gasc awoke all at once, head flying up to bring him to sitting, almost propelling him off his rump and into the air. The springiness and flexibility of his body was amazing, like nothing he had ever experienced before. Then he looked down at his hands, pink and supple and small, but strong, so strong. Springing off his bed, he padded barefoot to his bedroom mirror and looked at his reflection. His jaw dropped. Not the creased, slack jaw he was used to, a jaw that opened and closed like a shark, sharp and fast and precise. His hair was not gray and thin and balding, it was brown and long and shaggy. His back was not arched by decades of sitting and poring over scrolls, it was straight as an arrow, and his neck was pain-free and pliable. Eyes were no longer pale as raw meat, but blue and pure as summer sky. Quickly, he tore off his breeches and looked between his legs, shrugging and nodding a few times before lacing them back up. Then he strode languidly back to bed and dropped heavily back onto it, spotting a piece of parchment at his side. Picking it up, he read and dropped his jaw again. Donning his finest sable robes of the faith, with a sermon tome under his arm, he exited his bedroom and glanced across the kitchen floor at a large furry shape that dominated the entrance and interior of his pantry. Grabbing an iron candlestick and wielding it like a club, he approached, peering down at the naked minotaur, bleeding all over the floor of his pantry and sleeping soundly with the belly full of his entire household inventory inside. The shelves were bare, and a mighty rumble resounded from his gut. The noise awoke his mighty guest, who rose all at once, arms shooting out and splintering a shelf on each side. Lowering its head, the minotaur stepped through the pantry threshold, Gasc scrambling to get out of his way, dropping the candlestick in the process. Who are you? Gasc cried. An invading monster? Mard sighed deeply, holding his great paws out to calm the man, but instead appearing as if he was about to strangle him. Gasc backed all the way up to the kitchen counter, scattering pots and pans before managing to catch a rolling pin in 2 hands.
I am a gladiator of the Moortown fighting pits, Mard grumbled. A rolling pin won't do much to stop me.
Ah, Moortown. I always told my son never to go there. And that's where you're from, eh? You must be one of his friends. So that means he disobeyed me. Gasc, Mard began.
I think you need to look in the mirror.
Gasc? What? I already did. I am Eugene, Gasc's father. Mard raised a quizzical brow before gripping the man by both shoulders, suffering the blow of a rolling pin to the neck, but flinching it off before gently lifting the pin out of Gasc's hands. Then Mard turned Gasc around and led him by the shoulders back to his mirror. The Minotaur stood beside him, his head cut off by the mirror, but as he stood as tall as the Minotaur's pectorals, the man now digested his reflection. He had taken on the form of his son. Where's that damn life priest? I know he's the head of the order, but this is outrageous.
You would be dead if not for him, Mard countered sharply. However, I am beginning to think we made a mistake. I was not under my own free will at the time, but I must say, you are far less interesting than your son was. Gasc, that little brat! I cannot believe this. I'll never forgive him. Where? I can't do anything about it. Can I? He's gone. My son. He's really gone.
Mard patted Gasc on the shoulder and said,
I guess we are both a bit disappointed by this whole turn of events, but at least you're alive. Perhaps there is more work for you to be done in the light of your faith. The head of your order must have brought you back for a reason. There is no reason for any of this. It's all just chaos. Particles vibrating into each other. I'm sure of that now. I'm a 40-year-old man in the body of a 13-year-old boy. An old spirit, it's true. But does that not make you the best of both worlds?
Gasc rubbed his chin, where a beard, or at least some stubble, used to be. That would take some time. He did raise a finger, however, as light shot into his blue eyes. 7.
I always wanted to learn how to fence. Fencing? Blah. That is a sport that ends in little bloodshed. I prefer killing. Well, at any rate, watch and learn.
Mard kicked down the poles that erected a lone, fragrant tent standing in the marketplace on sermon day. 3 scrambling shapes stumbled and bobbed beneath the bulk of the leather-hide tent before emerging from its far side. Mard was waiting for them. The Minotaur's great axe came down with such force on the neck of Saeed the Shiv that his head launched airborne for 7 feet before toppling to the cobbles. Next came Moloch the Mouse, whom Mard lifted by his neck and choked in one massive paw. Meeping sounds escaped from his lips as his face turned scarlet and eyes bulged in his head until blood ran over the lids. Tossing the broken Turon to the ground, Mard and Gasc waited for Gwab the Golden to emerge. Gasc leveled his longsword, the decorative symbol of his faith that Mard had begged him to replace the blacksmith with a real warrior's sword, but Gasc had denied. This sword was meant to carry the weight of our nation's honor and valor in battle, and so I shall stain it with the blood of those who rob and corrupt our people, Gasc had explained. Not long ago, you were doing a good bit of robbing and corrupting yourself, Mard remarked at the time. That was my son. I am much more respectable. We shall see about that. Gasc stood at the rear of the tent, awaiting Gwab's exit. However, Saeed and Moloch had both chosen to go through that end of the tent, and Gwab had heard them meet their ends after choosing that course of action. So instead, Gwab darted back to the other side of the tent, seeking an exit there. Springing to that side, Gasc was there for him. But this Gwab seemed to hear. Gwab then started back the other way before Mard stomped his hoof on that end. Turning back to Gasc's end, the merchant considered that escape route before his knife appeared in the center of the tent, cutting a wide hole through which he peeled open the top half. Gasc stepped on the tent to get to Gwab at its center, but seeing this, Gwab pulled the leather taut, launching Gasc's 100-pound body backward into the air to land heavily on his rump. Gasc plunged forward, grabbing Gwab by his hair and bringing him before Gasc. Finally, Gasc found his feet and drew back his longsword, prepared to deliver the finishing blow upon Gwab's exposed throat. Slowly, the tip of Gasc's longsword drooped to the ground. This isn't right, Gasc began. I can't do this. Do you mean to let him go? Mard loosened his grip on Gwab. Hells no! Just find a scimitar and release him. I want a fencing lesson. Mard tilted his head to the side and nodded slowly in approval, dragging Gwab over to his tent and bending over, fishing about under the hides for a scimitar. Got to be a scimitar in there. They're Turons, aren't they? Gasc said excitedly, stabbing his longsword into the air in the direction of Gwob's face. The one they call Golden proved his name as a drizzle of that color erupted from the front of his robes.
Voila! Quick hands!
Mard exclaimed, shoving Gwob a few feet away and tossing the scimitar into the air. The Turan managed to catch the blade by its hilt, and as he did, weaved it through the air in an impressive display of skill. Gasc gulped hard before setting his stance. Gwob came on like a whirlwind of steel, slamming his curved blade against Gasc's straight-edged blade. Buckling under the force of the blow, the ambushman countered with a horizontal forehand chop, which Gwob easily parried and deflected. Gwob allowed Gasc to carry his momentum on and slashed into the small of Gasc's back as he passed.
Gah!
The ambushman shouted as he gripped the wound, but quickly settled back into his stance. Blood had been the Turan's first flash of freedom, and so he came on with all his strength, dropping diagonal strikes onto Gasc's blade from both directions. Gasc lost ground, backing up almost to the wall of a building before ducking under an attack to seek some open space. Growling, Gwob gave chase, leaping forward with a massive overhand slash that Gasc barely parried, and hoping with a backhand slash to eviscerate Gasc, and would have if Mard had not caught Gwob's forearm. His paw engulfed the Turan's wrist and snapped it in half, carpals spilling to the ground. Gwob howled into the morning air, falling forward to his hands and knees. Mard shrugged and nodded at Gasc. Gasc sighed, brought his longsword up in two hands, and slashed it down through the Turan's neck, spilling his lifeblood on the cobbles.
I never asked, where did a creature like you come from?
Said Gasc, catching his breath and wiping sweat from his brow.
Another time and place. Not worth getting into now, but I can say it was a land of strong men and willing women. A land I long to get back to one day.
Another thing, where did that tentacle beast come from? Was that from your world as well?
It very well may have been, if things have gone that far awry. You see, there was a demon war, and...
As you said, it can wait for another time, Gasc yawned.
I am itching to try out this new body. Right you are. Now, we can head to the arena to promote my next game, can't we?
Mard asked pleadingly.
Yes, but first, we will pay a visit to Master Shank.
And after that, the temple of the beloved creator. Mard gave him a sideways glance.
All right, just the Shank household then.